This one comes from Tim in Newman, California. And Tim asked the question, if I can summarize the question, then I'll give you the whole thing. Tim asked the question, should Young's literal translation be our preferred translation? Should Young's literal translation be our preferred translation? Now, let me share with you a little more of what he had to say. He said, I have a question about literal Bible translations. I'm a King James preferred student of the Word. Now, like Tim, I'm also a King James preferred. I'm not a King James only, I'm a King James preferred, and I've talked about that a number of times, both on this program, and we have a complete 2 or 3 session course at randywhiteministries.org on why you should have a King James version. But Tim says, I'm a King James preferred. He says, I have a question concerning the King James, on whether it's the most literal English translation. But, I have considered the King James to be the most literal English translation. But since I found your ministry, I've noticed you're digging in deep to the meaning of words, providing definitions in the Greek and Hebrew. And the King James Version at times does more interpreting than translating than I would think. From time to time, you've offered Young's literal translation as a more literal rendering of the original language. I was wondering if there's any particular reason that you are not Young's literal preferred. Excuse me. The Young's literal seems not to be a very popular in quick internet searches, and Tim goes on to explain just a couple of reasons why. Now, let me explain why I'm not a Young's literal translation preferred Bible student. First of all, Young's literal translation is a very good literal translation, perhaps the best literal translation that is available in the English language. And yet it is not designed to be read. It is designed to be studied. That is, the Young's literal is wonderful if you want to diagram sentences. It's perfect if you want to understand exactly what the Greek said as close as it's possible in English. Here's basically what Young's literal translation is. It is an interlinear without the Greek portion there. So when you take the Young's literal, it keeps the word order as in Greek. Well, the problem is, as you know, that it is linguistically impossible to carry everything forward from one language into another language. They have rules that are mutually exclusive. So what Young's literal does is say, we're going to break, as much as is linguistically possible, we're going to break the English rules in order to stick with the Hebrew or the Greek words. Now, I say as much as is linguistically possible because honestly, if they absolutely kept the Hebrew order of words especially, or they absolutely kept the Greek order of words, much of it would be, you would be unable to read it because it just breaks too many rules of English grammar. See, the point is, and this is a kind of an obvious statement, but English is not Hebrew and English is not Greek. So, what we have here is that virtually, when you come to Young's literal translation, they've tried to keep that word order intact. And I think that's very good when you're actually really rolling up your sleeves and you're digging in to do some study. And the more you read in the Hebrew or in the Greek, the more you'll become comfortable with the odd word order of the Young's literal. But in the Young's literal, they have tried to do as little as possible of interpreting. They just wanted to translate word for word, order for order, everything in there as a tool for the English-only student to use to get as close as they can without knowing Greek or without knowing Hebrew. So we could say virtually no interpretation is done. It's not completely true, but virtually no interpretation is done. Now, that can be a problem for the Bible reader versus the Bible student. What do I mean by that? The Bible reader is the one who is in a Sunday school class and standing before the Bible study, reading the scripture to the class. That's the Bible reader. Or the one who says, I've got 30 minutes here extra on my lunchtime. I'm just going to read the Bible. And that's the Bible reader. Now, the Bible student really is the one who does what we do so often, and that's word by word, verse by verse, line by line, precept by precept kind of study. When you're studying the Bible, you probably want to use a Young's literal translation. When you're reading the Bible, you probably don't want to use a Young's literal translation. Now, I want to look at a sample here, and let's just go to the scripture. I want to pick a very simple one, or a very popular one, easy to understand, and that would be John chapter 3, verse 16. And John 3:16, of course, you know what it is in the King James because most of you memorized it. Here it is in the Young's Literal. It says, "For God did so love the world that his Son, the only begotten, he gave, that everyone who is believing in him may not perish, but may have life age during." Now, as you notice, most of that you can kind of understand. But it's a little bit odd, for God did so love the world rather than God so loved the world. That his Son he gave. That his Son, dash, the only begotten, dash, he gave. Now, that's Greek word order, but it's a little hard to read. And then you come to the end and says, but, he may not perish, but may have life, age, during. What in the world does that mean? In fact, as Tim noted going on his letter, when you get on the internet, some people were very critical of the Young's literal translation because they didn't say everlasting life. They said life, age, during. Life, age, during. Now, honestly, what they did was literally translate the Greek as best as is possible. Let me give you an understanding of that word, because some of it that is translated eternal, some of it you'll understand. The Greek word, the root word is eon. Well, we understand that. Well, eons and eons. And an eon, of course, it is an age, and yet it's an age of an indefinite period. Eon, an age of an indefinite period. That's the root word. And here in John 3:16, it's actually the adjective, the adjectival form of that word, which is eonian, eonian. So what it literally says is they will have life eonian, life eonian. Now, eonian means an indefinite age. They will have life during that age, life during the indefinite age. That is what the Greek actually says. Now, here's the reason why you can't always go with a literal, because you have to take what it means. And words do come to have meaning. Now, the way you understand meaning is you look at all the times the word is used and say, what did the author mean when he said such and such? For example, of course, easy one in the English language would be the word cool. That's very cool. Well, are we talking about a temperature, or are we talking about some kind of demeanor that a person may have? Very cool. And you can't just literally translate that. You wouldn't go to Spanish and say, "Oh, he's very frío." That wouldn't communicate. So, in translating, you have to sometimes do some interpretation to say, in the language, it has come to mean this. We know it has come to mean this because we've checked all these other times, and this is contextually the way it is used. Now, what the King James and most English translations do is they go ahead and interpret for us. And as Tim said, there's more interpretation even in the King James than you would expect. And yet, I think that there's some inherent degree of interpretation that just has to be done. Now, that's the reason, by the way, I think you ought to read a Young's literal translation, or even better, you ought to learn to read Greek and learn to read Hebrew. And when you do that, then you can judge whether or not that interpretation is accurate. So let's suppose you don't want to learn Greek, or you can't learn Greek, you don't have time to learn Greek. You could pick up a Young's Literal Translation. And from that, you could note that there's something about this word that is interpreted by the time you get to the King James and the other English translations. I better dig in and I better study it. So Tim, I'd say when you study, take a Young's Literal Translation and use it. If you're trying to lead a Bible study, people are going to have a very hard time listening, following along, because it simply is not really English. It is. It would be like listening to a foreigner. You've heard a foreigner sometimes, whether they're South American or they're Chinese or from India or whatever, and they speak in a way that is translating from their language, their thought, into English, and sometimes we know what they mean, sometimes we don't even know what they mean. But when we hear it, we sort of laugh and say, oh, I understand how they translated that now, but now I need to interpret that over. So Young's Literal is it has no interpretation at all, so I think you ought to use. Now, most of you know, if you follow our Thursday night Bible studies, what I use side by side is a King James, a Greek or a Hebrew interlinear, and a Young's Literal Translation, and use those three tools to bring it all together. So, excellent question, Tim. I appreciate that.